Well, this week we're going to be taking a break with the Revelation series. We are going to be doing something topical, talking about finding biblical hope in a season of disappointment. Now, this whole quarantine has been kind of messing with my ability to keep track of time, and I've heard a lot of people say the same thing. Without the school or work or these other things that kind of govern the rhythms of life, it seems difficult to figure out what day it is. Even with this gathering on Sunday and Bible studies on Wednesday night, I'm still having trouble keeping things straight. Paradoxically, on the Bible Project podcast, Tim Mackey, who does the Bible Project, made this observation. He found that sheltering in place, it makes the days seem longer, but then at the very same time, the weeks seem to go by very fast. And a perfect example of that would be just this question, quick. How many of these online worships do you think we've done? So confer with the people that are with you this morning and see if you can come up. How many times have we at Tintern met like this online? So what do you think? In truth, the number is 11. In fact, this week we crossed the threshold. We have now, in the year 2020, worshipped online more times than we worshipped in the building normally. More than half of the year then, up to this date then, we have spent sheltering in place. Now, the days, they remain distinct, but the weeks have been kind of blurring together. We all seem to be sitting around kind of in this phase of waiting. Waiting, but what for? What are we waiting for? The milestones each week, they more often than not end up being bad news that punctuates the weeks. Either news of a financial crash, which incidentally the markets have made back more than half of what they lost in February, but that's a whole other story. Or it's bad news about rising unemployment, or some outrageously stupid thing that someone said. Week after week, it's been sickness or death or leadership crises punctuating the weeks, marking our transition or our progress through time. Different regions in Canada and in North America are talking about a return to some sense of normal, but it's clear that nobody knows for sure what's coming next, and whether it's even a good idea to go back to a familiar way of life. Is it even safe? These are very difficult times to be an optimist, but followers of Jesus Christ find it an opportunity to cultivate the ancient biblical character trait of hope. Now, we talked about this in a sermon, a few months ago now, the idea of biblical hope. Biblical hope is not like these thin, insubstantial kind of wishing hope that most people talk about, this wishy-washy, I hope it works out kind of thing. That's not what we're talking about. But biblical hope is solid. Biblical hope is an anticipation. Hope is a kind of waiting. Not waiting for circumstances to change, for our number of new cases to go down, or for our graph to change, but rather hope is waiting. The people who wrote the Bible, they went through very difficult times. They knew war and famine and disease. In fact, these things are not rare in human history. In fact, oftentimes the prophets told Israel things were going to get worse, not better. And yet they called Israel to a kind of hope. Putting hope in something. Hope that is not wishy-washy. Hope that is not connected with just the flighty nature of circumstances. So not things that change every day with the coming of good news or with bad news, but instead they waited on the one thing that would not change. They hoped on the one thing that could not be undone by our circumstances. They waited on the character of the one true God who had promised to restore and to heal his creation. We've all experienced disappointment, particularly in these last few weeks. A small disappointment I received this week is I got an email that a concert that Julie and I were planning on going to, a Lauren Daigle concert in Toronto this summer, was now officially canceled. We had been planning to go to that for almost a year now. Thursday, July the 2nd in Toronto. We had worried about how we were going to be able to get from Bible Day Camp during the day into Toronto in the afternoon for the concert in the evening, and then back home and get enough sleep to be able to come back for our last day of Bible Day Camp on the Friday. We were worried that we would be too busy. That all seems quaint now. But these kinds of disappointments are trivial in comparison to what many of you are struggling with. There were hundreds of people who would have dearly loved to be with Gene and the Hannah family yesterday as they said goodbye for now to Barry at his graveside service. There have been many funerals that have become memorial services that have been deferred until who knows when. Ron Tallman had his first grandson get married on Saturday, so congratulations to the Tallman family on this very exciting event. But only immediate family were able to be there. And both the bride's dress and the groom's suit were in lockup, held up by businesses that are still closed by COVID-19. But they made do, waiting, looking forward perhaps to a time in the future when they could celebrate more fully. We are disappointed, but we have hope. We are disappointed the Bible Day Camp and Camp Oma and Strawberry Point and other camps aren't going to happen this summer. We are disappointed that we're not going to be going back to school for a while now. We are disappointed for those who are graduating from high school this month, or those who've graduated from university or college and they won't get to mark the event with celebrations like they would have liked, with social gatherings, or at least they won't be able to do that for now. We are disappointed, but we have hope. We are waiting on the one who loves us, on the one who knows us, and on the one who is working to put all things right. We're waiting on the Lord and the character of the Lord that does not change. And so let's look this morning at 3 scriptures that help us to see the contours of what biblical hope is. This morning we've got readings that are going to be given to us by people who are experiencing and who are living into this kind of hope. Our first reading is Psalm 62. So if you've got a Bible, I'd invite you to have a Bible open or open a Bible on your phone and read along. This morning, Psalm 62 will be brought to us by Amanda Locke. It's Amanda Whitehead, who is one of Barry and Jean's granddaughters, and also our own Earl Warren. Psalm 62.
Psalms 62. I wait quietly before God, for my salvation comes from Him. He alone is my rock, my salvation, my fortress, where I will never shaken.
How long will you assault a man? Would all of you throw him down, this leaning wall, this tottering fence? They fully intend to topple him from his lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from Him.
He alone is my rock, my salvation, my fortress, where I will not shaken. My salvation and my honor come from God alone.
Trust in Him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to Him, for God is our refuge. Low-born men are but a breath. The high-born are but a lie. If weighed in a balance, they are nothing. Together they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion, or take pride in stolen goods, though your riches increase. Do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, 2 things have I heard, that you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are loving. Surely you will reward each person according to what he has done.
Here in Psalm 62, hope is described as waiting quietly. in verse 2 and in verse 6. Hope is not described as wishful thinking, but instead is substantive. They use words like God is a fortress, that God is a rock, God is a refuge. And in verse 3, David shames his attackers. Now, you might not feel like you've got people circling around you looking for a chance to knock you down or to push you over. But the mental picture that we have here is a wall of stone set without mortar that are towering up and they're leaning one way and then the other. It's a picture of a teetering pile of rocks, and all it's going to take is one push to knock this thing down. So maybe that sounds just about right. Maybe you feel like a towering pile of rocks that's just one push away from being scattered all over the ground. In verse 4, David sounds like he's got some trouble with some mean girls in his life, some people picking on him. But perhaps you have felt the bite of slander this week or the dull ache of offense. David knows what it feels like, and he names it here for us in Psalm 62. The contrast here in the psalm is between these unstable and uncertain threats with a God whose character is steady like a fortress, a firm rock that can't be moved. And biblical hope is based on the character of God and not on personal circumstances. God's past faithfulness is what motivates our hope for the future. You hope forward by looking backwards through faith. God has faithfully seen us this far, and God is going to continue to be faithful in the future. Hope comes from trust, and trust comes from pouring out your hearts to God, David says in verse 8. And so if you're having difficulty right now at the onset, imagining what this hope might look like, David would suggest right here, tell God about it. Tell God about your fears. Tell God what makes it so hard to believe that God is good in store for us. This is part of what makes the Bible so remarkable. It doesn't play cute or tiptoe around realities, but instead it goes right to the hard things in life. And as we're going to see in the next reading, it's very honest about suffering. Now, if you don't feel like God has been faithful in the past, tell him in prayer. God can handle it. This is called lament. And it's something that we're not very good at. We're good at complaining, but we aren't necessarily good at lament. Lament is just an honest accounting of exactly what it is that you're worried about. Pour it out before God, the one that can actually do something about it. Casting your cares before God, that's lament. Now, we do our fair share of complaining, but this is different. Pouring out your fears and cares before God, even if you can't find the words, just crying before the Lord, just giving that cry of anguish, asking God to reveal to you how he's been faithful. Ask God for sight, for vision, to be able to see a hopeful way forward. Before we move on to the next reading, I want you to look at verse 11. The hope that we have here is grounded in two things. One, that God holds all the power, and two, that God's love never fails. Our hope is based on this true statement. Right now, even during a pandemic, even during loss and grief and sorrow, God is strong enough to do what needs to be done. God is wise enough to know what our true needs really are. And God's loving enough to make sure that it happens. Our second text this morning is from Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 14. Lamentations chapter 3, starting in verse 14, and it's brought to us by Greg Toohey. Greg is the minister of the Stratford Church of Christ, and he's also a grandson of Barry and Jean.
My own people laugh at me. All day long they sing their mocking songs. He has filled me with bitterness and given me a bitter cup of sorrow to drink. He has made me chew on gravel. He has rolled me in the dust, peace has been stripped away, and I have forgotten what prosperity is. I cry out, my splendor is gone. Everything I hoped for from the Lord is lost. The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet still, I dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning. I say to myself, the Lord is my inheritance, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who depend on him, to those who search for him. So it is good to wait quietly for salvation from the Lord. And it is good for people to submit at an early age to the yoke of his discipline. Let them sit alone in silence beneath the Lord's demands. Let them lie face down in the dust, for there may be hope at last. Let them turn the other cheek to those that strike them and accept insults from their enemies. For no one is abandoned by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he also shows compassion because of the greatness of his unfailing love. For he does not enjoy hurting people or causing them sorrow.
Lamentations is a profound book, at least for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's an acrostic poem. Each verse in each chapter begins with a consecutive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. But what's more profound about it is that the entire book, 5 chapters, is all lament. It's sorrow. It goes down into the depths with vivid word pictures, and it just never comes up, except for 4 verses, right in the middle of what Greg read for us this morning. It's the 4 verses there is probably the only part of Lamentations that you've ever heard, but the rest of it is a profoundly bitter lament. You see, Jeremiah is devastated by the destruction of Jerusalem. Many of his friends are dead. The city has been destroyed. Everything he had hoped for, everything he knew, was gone. His whole life was ruined. No matter how badly our lives go, no matter what the impact of this pandemic, no matter how disruptive, we are likely never going to see the despair that Jeremiah felt. The word pictures that he describes are dizzyingly vivid and horrible. Again, the Bible is surprisingly honest. But Jeremiah is moved in the middle of the chapter to find courage to hope forward by looking back in faith. In verse 20, in the JPS Jewish translation, it reads, "But this do I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The kindness of the Lord is not ended. His mercies are not spent. They are renewed every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion. I will say with my full heart. Therefore I will hope in him." Jeremiah, in the midst of this nightmare, bases his hope on God's character, which does not change. But it still leaves us with a question, and it often still leaves us with tears. But it is the hope that endures. Biblical hope waits. It waits for God, facing forward while looking back in faith. A third text this morning from the New Testament. Paul writes these words to the Romans, and this reading is brought to us by Trevor.
Romans chapter 8, verse 18 to 25. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved, but hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently.
Here, Paul invites the Christians in Rome to see their present sufferings from a different perspective, to look at their hardships as an expression of the groaning of all creation over death and decay. This world is not the way it's meant to be. Disease and conflict and death and suffering are not meant to be part of God's creation. These things have come into the world as a result of sin. The world is broken, and Paul says figuratively it groans. And so your frustration waiting in line to get into the grocery store so that you can wait in line to get out of the grocery store, your frustration with wearing a mask, whether you find that to be a hardship or not, your daily struggle to keep working if you still have a job, and keeping your kids on track with their schoolwork, all of this difficulty, all of this stress that we're dealing with, it's all part of the world crying out to God, the Creator, who is someday going to put everything right. Paul is saying that the resurrection of Jesus is the first step in the renewal of all things, new heavens and new earth. So what do we do right now? Paul says we wait. We wait with hope. During one of the darkest times in Israel's history, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "At this moment the Lord has hidden his face from us, so I will hope in him." And there, that word, that Hebrew word for hope, is kavah. Now, it means to wait. It's related to another word, kav, which means a cord or a rope. And so the picture here with this word is this rope or cord that's being held tight in tension. And we are waiting, anticipating that this cord is going to slip or the cord is going to break and produce release and this feeling of kavah. So we're waiting in anticipation. We're waiting to see what comes next. Here is Israel's only hope. It's to wait on God, for God to do what God does, for God to bring the restoration that God is going to bring. So they live in expectation, in anticipation of redemption, in anticipation of resurrection, in anticipation of the response of the one who's faithful and true. Paul says we hope for things that we don't see yet. We hope forward by looking back in faith. We hope with patience. Biblical hope is on a person and not on circumstances, which makes it different than optimism. You see, optimism is the capacity to look at outcomes and to consider forward into the future how things might end up working out to be the best. But biblical hope is not based on circumstances. In fact, oftentimes in the Bible, people hope in the face of outrageous misfortune in circumstances that are never going to get any better. They wait on the Lord instead, in light of what God has previously done. God's past faithfulness is what motivates hope for the future. You hope forward by remembering backwards in faith. And I believe that this season of our disappointment is a time of testing that's going to bring great blessings for those who learn to hope. Well, what if things don't get any better? What if things don't get any better? How can we learn to hope then? Hope is anticipating a future that's better than the present, even if it doesn't look like it's going to come, through trusting that God is love. Trusting that God is the creator of everything and that God is faithful and God is true and God will deliver us into that great day. Songwriter Sarah Groves and her husband made a big decision a number of years ago. They were embarking on a bold step. Sarah was a teacher in Minnesota, and she was going to leave behind a career in teaching to sing and to songwrite full-time as a profession. And yet, right out of the gate, a devastating financial loss appeared to foreclose on all these possibilities. It was over before it really had a chance to begin. And so Sarah sat down at the piano to write a song of disappointment, a lament. But instead, she felt called to look back. A seed was planted in her mind, an invitation. A voice said, if you can find a scenario one time in your past where God did not make himself known, one time where God was not with you through the darkest valley, then write about that. And so she thought back through her life. She thought back through the life of her parents and her grandparents, and a doubting song became a song of hope and a song of faithfulness. Sarah recognized that she's in the middle of her story. It's not over yet. It's so hard here in the middle of our story to see where this is going when we don't know what's coming next. But hope trusts looking forward while remembering the faithfulness of God in the past. And so out of this season, the song, He's Always Been Faithful, inspired by the words of the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, which is in turn inspired by the words of Lamentations chapter 3, which Greg read for us today. It is the song that she ends every concert with, including the one that Julie and I went to with some dear friends 8 years ago.